living in a pandemic of labelling. How can that be a problem? Well, what if you labelled all your food as just food? You'd never actually get what you want, right? Additionally, what if you had a problem with the car and you only told the mechanic, we have a problem with the car? What the mechanic would need to do would be to find the specific problem and then find the solution that deals with that problem. So how can we be in a pandemic of labelling? Well, at the end of the day, a lot of people who I see who go to see doctors seem to come out with a condition. And it seems to be a pandemic. You see, doctors don't have time to understand the ins and outs, the specifications of someone's lifestyle in order to fix it. Instead, they've got 10 minutes to analyse, understand the chemical issues, and then prescribe. And in order to do so, they have to categorise you into boxes. Now, that's interesting. What happens if someone says to you, I've had a bad day? You probably think, right, your subconscious mind goes deep and pulls out a day where you had a bad day. And then you grow with that person, you have some empathy and you decide, I know how that feels, oh yeah, that must have been terrible, I hope you're okay. And that's great because that connects us as people. But what if, when they've had a bad day, that's all they describe to you? You just take it as a bad day. However, have you had days that have been a bad day like that? And that's how you described it. You said, look, I had a terrible day at work, nothing really came about, everything fell apart, and it's just been the worst day ever. And then, maybe on a different time, you went into work and similar things occurred, and yet you took it with a different stride. And you said, oh, it's not that bad, oh, it's just a small problem, oh, we'll sort it out, don't worry. And through that, somehow it didn't feel as heavy, it didn't feel as problematic, it didn't feel as challenging. You see, what happens is, when we use language to communicate with others and with ourselves, it triggers an instant emotional response. The words will trigger your memory and your emotions in order to put you in that state again. Now, why is this important? Well, when we was growing up through years of civilization, what had happened is the only way we teach each other is we didn't have the written language, we used to tell stories. This is how we learned everything. And this is why it's so important. Storytelling is the key of human fundamental emotional drivers as well. We'd sit around a fire and the chief would say, we went out, this happened. There was a berry, you cannot eat this berry, it's deadly. You can't eat this other berry, it'll make you sick. Okay. Using specific words, what they've done is you've got two different associations straight away. That one's deadly, I can't go anywhere near that. That one I could eat, it might make me a bit sick. That one, if I eat, I see things. But the only way we learned anything was through communication. Storytelling had to be specific with language to make sure that the whole culture, that the whole society could carry on. So what happens with this pandemic label that I'm talking about? What do I mean, pandemic of labelling? Let me think about this. Does the news that you watch use a specific language? When you're watching the news, what kind of things do they say? Think about it. You hear things of the stock crash. Well, that's devastating. Economic crash, meltdown. These are all emotionally triggering words. And often what you'll find is if you actually take a little list of adjectives and you watch the news, 90% were negative. And as I said, the words we use trigger emotions. So what's the problem? Have you ever noticed how depressed people, anxious people, tend to communicate with themselves? Yes, they use the body in a certain way. Yes, they have problems. But have you ever noticed that when they communicate their own issues, or when they talk about their own life, or anything, they use intense, negative language. Intensely negative. My world has fallen apart. There's no reason to be here anymore. I'm pathetic. I'm useless. I'm a burden. What's the point? I can't do anything right. That's so negatively charged. There's no hope. I feel empty. There's no point. No. Take the same depressed person, the same anxious person. Ask them to communicate something positive. Or talk about when something positive happened. Yeah, well, I guess it was okay. Well, yeah, back then it was alright, it was good, but don't you see, and it's very interesting to see, that they are using very diminished, positive wording or language to communicate with themselves. They're using very intense negative communication, super intense negative communication. And yet, when it comes to anything positive, that is diminished. The words they use, triggering their emotional responses, are somehow deflated by their communication to themselves, by the language they choose to use as a pattern, as a habit, as something that they've built up over time. And maybe they even learned from listening to other people. Maybe one time they was positive, they was outrageous, enlightened, they felt excited, and someone else put them down for feeling so. They used a powerful, positive word and someone said, why are you being so positive? Don't be too optimistic, don't be foolish, and put them down. It's interesting that the people you spend time with, you actually build your language internally with how they speak as well. So it could be the influences around you, or such negative things as the news, as dramas, as TV shows like this, that are subconsciously feeding your emotional responses on day to day until it's a pattern that actually brings you down. And you've never even noticed it. Write down of all the adjectives you use or descriptive language you use when describing yourself. And then decide, is it positive, negative, and how intensely charged is that? When was the last time you used an empowering phrase? And now this all bottles down to what I was talking to before. In order to learn language or learn anything, what we had to do was sit around a fire and tell each other stories. This was the key to human behavioural drivers, to understanding how to act within the social environment and how to survive. Now, if we take that seriousness and we think about it like this, every single day we are sat around our own fire in our minds. We are the chief. And though words may slip in, and habits and patterns, empty thoughts do slip in, you are the chief storyteller in your mind. And through that story, you can actually trigger emotional responses. How do I know this? Imagine you was playing a character. Imagine for a second you was a CEO or a king, someone powerful, someone... How did they talk to themselves? When you go to play this character in your mind, you'd actually say things differently. You'd say, I wouldn't take that, I'm not going to be put down in this kind of way. I'm elegant, I'm creative, I'm powerful. These kind of phrases would subconsciously be there as you describe yourself in the story. You change your emotional state by changing the language you communicate yourself with. So how could it be that we're in a pandemic of labelling? Well, at the end of the day, if every single time you have a problem or an issue or a challenge, or you feel slightly nervous and you use the word anxiety, what does that do? And every time you feel down or frustrated or angry, you used I'm depressed, that's who I am, the story you're telling yourself. Well, the first thing it does, by labelling something as a category, as something that you believe you have and that isn't responsible of your actions, what you do is remove all power and responsibility from it. What does this mean? When you say I have anxiety, that means you're a victim. When you say I am depressed, that means you're a victim. You could be frustrated by something someone else has done, or worried about an outcome that hasn't happened yet. But instead of communicating with that with yourself, saying I'm a bit worried that this person might not like me, that person shouldn't have treated me this way, instead of communicating that, you just say, well, I'm depressed and I'm anxious, that's not okay, I don't feel good. Also, when you think of anxiety and depression, it's often a pattern. It's a pattern that builds, it snowballs. You start at the top. That person might not like me. I'm not good enough. And what you tend to do is communicate a deeply negative story in your mind, adding more adjectives, more power, more creativity to diminish your own emotional state. Oh, I did that wrong. That didn't go too well. Just like the other things in your life that haven't gone well. You're probably pathetic. Things will never change. Do you see how this is snowballing? Things will never change. You are this. You'll only ever amount to this. Nobody cares about you. Why would they care about you when you keep messing? That is a pattern. Anxiety. This person might not like me. I wonder if everyone's looking at me at the party. What happens if they don't like me? Well, they might judge me. Well, then I'm going to end up alone because everyone's going to judge me and see that I'm not as confident as I seem to be. And you start to build this pattern in your mind. What if this happens? What if? What if? What if the story you told yourself was changed? What if you became the cultivator, the person who artistically sculpted your own communication in your mind, in your subconscious, in order to feel a better emotional response? We are living in a pandemic of labeling because we keep using super negatively charged words in order to create an example of an outcome. Instead of saying I'm a bit shy, instead of saying I'm a bit nervous, I'm frustrated, they shouldn't have treated me like that. Instead of saying I deserve better, what you tend to say is I'm depressed, I'm really down, I'm anxious, I'm scared, I'm afraid, I'm having an anxiety attack. You can create the stage in your mind and you can set the story of who you want to be. But unless we start to actually find the specific problem, like the mechanic, we will never find the specific solution. And you will forever feel powerless and without salvation. Be specific with yourself. Tell it how it is. And we can remove this pandemic of labeling and start to communicate effectively to make sure that you live a better life.